So it's only recently that I've discovered the work of Joe Hill. I'm not really sure why it took me so long to find him, but it wasn't really until the Black Phone movie that came out recently that he really appeared on my radar. Since then, I've tried to read or watch a lot more of his work. I liked Lock and Key, and I enjoyed Basketful of Heads, but most of all, I think I've enjoyed his 2020 graphic novel, Plunge. Plunge has the feeling of other classic science fiction horror. To me, Plunge has elements of Lovecraftian horror, John Carpenter's The Thing, and it's very similar to other graphic novels like Red Fork, which also came out in 2020. It's short and not too intense, but before we get to the details, as always, this is a recap, which means there will be spoilers. If you haven't read Plunge, please go do that first. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Plunge starts with a tsunami, after which the Coast Guard picks up a strange distress signal. The signal seems to be coming from the derelict, or derelict, I'm not really sure how this ship's name is pronounced, but I'm going to say derelict. A ship which disappeared way back in 1983. Presumably the tsunami brought the sunken ship back up to the surface somehow, where the signal's now kicking in. Next we're introduced to the salvage ship Macready, which is captained by Gage Carpenter. He and his brothers Clark and Russell run the Carpenter Wreck Removal Company, with the ship, of course. A VP from the company Rococo International, Mr. Lakem, wants to hire the ship to investigate the derelict before the Russians can get to it, since it's sitting in waters contested by the Russians. There's also a marine biologist named Mariah Lamb who wants to join the expedition to collect samples the derelict supposedly collected in the past. Captain Carpenter agrees and the expedition sets out. They reach the atoll and some of the crew want to go ashore and investigate. They're sitting around a fire drinking mushroom tea, which some of them think is coffee, when Mariah leaves the group because she has to go to the bathroom. While on her way, she stumbles upon a dead body of a man. His eyes are missing and his throat's been cut. She swears, though, that she thinks she hears the dead man speak to her, but it's just a lifeless body, so she kind of thinks she's going crazy. But then the others arrive. With Clark, Russell, and Mariah is another man named Bill. He's a larger Native American man, and it's pretty clear that he's in a relationship with Mariah. The crew call the Macready, and they come to take the body back to the ship. Mr. Lakem seems to know who the dead man is, though he's kind of keeping it a secret. He calls him Peter, so there's definitely something he's not letting on here. Back on the ship though, Captain Gage is sending a probe down to investigate the submerged portion of the derelict. The probe finds large scratch marks scraped into the ship before it's eaten by a large worm-like creature. While walking around the atoll, Mariah notices that crabs are covered in this oil-like substance. She decides to dive underwater to investigate. Beneath the water she sees these totems, and carved onto them are these distorted faces with worms crawling out of them. Aboard the Macready, Peter, the corpse, wakes up and attacks one of the ship's crew, killing him. While this is happening, back on the atoll where Russell and Bill are climbing this mountain that's on the island, they discover a cave. Inside the cave at the top, Russell finds the digits of pi carved into the rock face. He follows the digits down, they're kind of spiraling down into the cave, and at the bottom he finds this big circular design carved into the wall. Just then though, the Macready suddenly explodes off the coast of the atoll. Captain Gage and his crew survive, but now they're throwing these fire extinguishing balls at the fire to try and put it out. I mention these because they kind of become important later. Back in the cave, figures begin crawling out of this hole in the wall that Russell found. There are several men, all of which are missing their eyes, similar to the corpse that Mariah found earlier. The man in charge introduces himself to Russell. He says his name is Julian, and the rest of the men with him are the surviving crew of the derelict. He says that they've been surviving on the island since the accident, and that their eyes were eaten out by worms that are native to the island. Russell, Bill, and the crew of the derelict come back down the peak. Russell's now wearing these headphones that let him hear people's thoughts. And Bill is holding this item that he's really protective of, and he won't let anybody else touch it, kind of like the One Ring. The group meet back up with Clark and Mariah, and Julian says that he wants to speak to Captain Gage. And Captain Gage comes ashore. With the storm on the horizon though, Julian leads the captain and his crew into this small hut. Julian has a bit of an exposition dump here. He says that he's seen the final digit of pi. He says that it's opened up this infinite amount of possibilities. Julian offers Captain Gage a small vial of this special kind of oil. The oil is so powerful that even a small drop of it, according to Julian, can power all of California for over 1100 years. Also, to demonstrate the power of two other objects that he's giving to Captain Gage, Julian and his crew cut the object, called the ingot, from Bill's grasp. Julian's men then throw the object where several members of Gage's crew can see it, and then they proceed to tear each other apart to get the ingot back. Eventually Bill gets it again, but he loses an eye in the process. I think it's implied that this is the reason that the crew of the derelict all took their eyes out. Julian eventually reveals that he's actually made up of these worm-like creatures, smaller versions of the ones that they saw under the water. These creatures inhabit a host, and this is hinting at the reason why they haven't really aged, because they're not really alive. He says that there are 28 members of the derelict that are like, quote-unquote, alive. Julian eventually tells Captain Carpenter what it is that he wants, though. He says that he needs Gage's crew to dive off the coast of the atoll, then open up a large hatch that's found underwater. Julian claims that once the hatch is open, he and his kind can board the ship and leave the planet once and for all. He calls it a lifeboat. When Julian is asked why he can't dive down himself and open the hatch, since there are clearly these worms already underwater, he says that the hatch is made of a special type of metal not found on Earth, one that kills the creatures if they touch it. Captain Gage refuses to help the creatures with their mission. As a result, the crew of the derelict attack Clark and the man named Bosley, forcing the worms down their throats. The worms take over Bosley, but they are forced out of Clark as a result of the mushroom tea he was drinking earlier. The worms say his body is unclean. Mr. Latham reminds Julian that they were given 24 hours to think the proposal over. Julian agrees, and the crew of the Macready head back to their ship, where they try to come up with a plan. While they're thinking, Gage remembers the corpse they brought on earlier. Now that he knows how these worm creatures work, he grabs the body and starts shouting questions at it. The body does respond, but it doesn't feel compelled to answer any of Gage's questions. He says there's no amount of torture that Gage could put on him or the host body that will convince him to compel or reveal any of his secrets. Russell has the idea to use the mind-reading headphones to dive deeper into the creature's subconscious, where he can get answers. The only problem is that they've noticed these headphones take a huge physical toll on him and his brain. He decides it's the only way though, and he puts on the headphones. And okay, here's where things get weird. It turns out that the worms are actually reproductive cells, like sperm, and the hatch under the water is an egg of sorts. The sperm worms want to get to the egg so that they can make a baby. Like I said, it's weird. Russell dies as a result of this subconscious dive, and the crew are locked into the room with the corpse by Mr. Latham. Mr. Latham tried to x-ray the ingot in Bill's hand earlier, and as a result, he became obsessed with it too. He now wants to help Julian so that he will be given the ingot as a reward. Inside the room, in this fit of fury, Gage cuts the corpse to pieces and all the worms and parasites inside of it and everything. This really pisses Julian off though, who comes aboard to grab the crew. They take him back ashore and tie them to those totems that Mariah saw underwater earlier, except now they've been exposed. They're jutting up from the shore. Mariah is the only one not tied up though. Julian tells Mariah that she needs to dive and open up the hatch for them, since they can't open up themselves. It's supposedly made of this special metal, like I said earlier. The tide is rising though, and if she can't get the hatch open in time, her friends will drown. She quickly suits up against the protests of Gage, Bill, and Clark, and she dives. She reaches the vault hatch and pries it open. The derelict crew then enter the water and the parasites flood from their bodies. The worms then enter the hatch. At the same time as this is happening, the Russian sub enters the area. A massive tentacle creature shoots from the waters. It grabs and crushes the Russian submarine. The water is rising and some of the crew are submerged. Clark drowns, unfortunately. And the others, Mariah manages to release and then make it back to land. They look on at the massive creature. It's growing rapidly and it's beginning to tear through reality itself. Gage has lost both his brothers at this point, and his entire crew. He blames himself for all of it. He has a plan to kill the creature though. He says that he's been given everything they need by the infected derelict crew, who must have known deep down what was actually needed to destroy the creatures. Each of the 3 gifts given to them earlier will play a major role in the plan. The headphones revealed what was actually inside the hatch, a massive cosmic horror style creature. The ingot from earlier, Gage shows to the creature, causing it to follow him back down into the water and into the hatch. Gage then detonates a special oil, triggering a massive explosion using one of those fire extinguishing balls that I mentioned earlier. It kills the beast. Bill and Mariah stare off in the distance as the explosion rises. The graphic novel then ends with a glimpse of Mr. Latham, who has survived and who is now infected by one of the creatures. A little sequel bait there. Plunge was a pretty good read overall. I don't actually think the story was all that unique in the beginning, with the worm-like creatures infecting a host. I know we've seen this in some form or another countless times. But even though there were elements of the story that were super common, there were still hints of unique ideas that I enjoyed here. In particular, I like the idea of the worms just being reproductive cells. To me, this created a real sense of scope. Suddenly, the small threat grew into some large mystery creature looming in the mind of the crew. The worms were already shown to be incredibly intelligent and aggressive, and you can only imagine what the intelligence of something larger would be, so it really creates a threat before you ever see it. The story lacked any real scares though, so for that reason, I only give Plunge a 1 on the scary meter. The scariest moment for me was the realization, like I just mentioned, that the creatures were essentially meaningless, reproductive cells. What the story lacked in scares though, I think it made up for in action. That means that this story was packed with blood and gore. Sometimes I found myself even a little surprised by the level of gore in this graphic novel. I gave Plunge a well-earned 3 on the bloody meter. The most graphic and exciting scene to me would have to be when Gage goes all Evil Dead on the corpse in the ship using a chainsaw. It's violent, and it's surprising seeing Julian's reaction to the scene. If you haven't had a chance to check out Plunge, and you for some reason watched this video, be sure to check it out. Overall, the book was good in the end, may have wrapped up a little quickly, but I think you would still enjoy it. This video though is just meant to recap important plot points for future reference, so you would still benefit from reading this yourself. Well, I've said my bit about Joe Hill's Plunge. Let me know yours in the comments. Thank you all for watching these bite-sized retro recaps. See you all in the next story. Bye.